Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Turkey because over the course of the past few days, events have taken a severe downward turn. The stock market has fallen by almost 15%, making it the single worst performance since the global financial crisis in 2008. And on Wednesday, the 19th of March, the value of the lira fell by more than 12% to an all-time low, and that resulted in the Turkish central bank having to step in and spend $12 billion supporting the value. And in conjunction with the fall in the value of the lira, the Turkish central bank also increased the overnight borrowing rate to 46%. So what's going on in Turkey? What's caused all of the markets to suddenly crash? Well, all of this relates to the arrest and detention of the main rival to President Erdogan, who is charged with corruption and of supporting terrorist organisations. Ekrem İmamoğlu, who's the current Istanbul mayor, was arrested on Wednesday the 19th of March in a move that the main opposition party in Turkey have called a coup against our next president. İmamoğlu, who leads Erdogan in some opinion polls, was due to be named the Republican People's Party's official presidential candidate within the next few days. However, he now faces two separate investigations that also include charges of leading a crime organisation, bribery and tender rigging. Germany, France, the European Union and the Council of Europe all came out and criticised İmamoğlu's detention, while the US State Department said that it expected Ankara to act in a way that respects the rights of its citizens. So things are clearly heating up in Turkey. So let's start off by taking a look at what happened to the stock market. This chart shows the movement in the Bora Istanbul 100, which are the 100 largest listed companies in Turkey over the past 12 months. And I think the immediate takeaway from looking at this chart is that over the last year, there has been a lot of uncertainty in terms of the valuation of Turkish companies. It has been up and down, which is unlike most of the other stock markets. However, if we zoom in and have a look at what's happened over the course of the past few days, you can see that on March the 17th, the index was sitting at a level of 10,900. However, as you can see from the almost vertical line, by the 21st of March, the index had fallen to just over 9,000, which represents a fall of around 15% within a 4-day period, and that is officially classified as a crash. And this is as a result of the political uncertainty that is now rising in Turkey. Everybody is very nervous about what's going to happen in the economy, and at times when the markets get nervous, valuations start to plummet, and overseas investors particularly look to exit at times when there is political and economic unrest. This chart shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Turkish lira over the past 12 months. And what this shows is that 12 months ago, one US dollar was trading for around 32 Turkish lira. However, today it's trading for 37.4. However, if we zoom in and have a look at what's been happening over the past few days, you can see that at the start of trading on March the 19th, one US dollar was trading for 36.6 Turkish lira. However, during the course of that day, when it was announced that the main opposition leader had been arrested, the value of the lira started to crash, and at one stage was trading for 39.3 against the US dollar, which actually marked a new all-time low for the lira. Now, the crash in the value of the lira was too much for the Turkish central bank, who stepped into the market and reportedly spent $12 billion supporting the value of the lira. It was selling foreign currency to keep the value of the lira under control, and as a result of that, it came back down to around the current level of 37.8. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Turkey over the past 12 months, and what you can see here are two specific trends. This time 12 months ago, inflation was sitting at 67% in Turkey, and by May 24, it had increased to more than 75%. However, over the course of the last 9 months, inflation has been coming down, and the most recent figure published for February 25 shows that it's now sitting at 39%. So when you look at this chart, it looks like Turkey is improving. Things are starting to get better. However, I think it's important to look at the actual rate here, because 39% inflation is incredibly high. And when you compare that to the rest of the G20, there is only one country, Argentina, where inflation is sitting at a higher level. It's currently around 67% in Argentina. And if we look at this table, which shows the whole of the globe, you can see that Turkey currently has the 5th highest rate of inflation in the world. The only countries that have higher levels are Syria, where it's 120%, and Syria is a war-torn country, South Sudan, which is also war-torn, where it's sitting at 113%, Argentina we just talked about, and Zimbabwe, whose economy collapsed many years ago, where inflation is now sitting at 57%. However, as you can see from this table, we don't have any updated figures for Zimbabwe for almost 12 months. So the current rate of inflation in Zimbabwe could be significantly higher. But looking at this, you can see just how severe the problem in Turkey is at the moment. Although inflation is coming down, it's still at incredibly high rates. And that causes major problems because if prices are rising by 39%, you need your income to at least be rising by 39% just to maintain your standard of living. This chart shows the movement in food inflation in Turkey over the past 12 months. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that we always like to look at food inflation because food price increases affect the poorest members of society the most because they're spending a much larger percentage of their budget on food. And what you can see here is that over the last 12 months, food inflation has been coming down. In March 24, it was sitting at 70%, which is an incredibly high rate. So things have improved in Turkey. And the most recent figures for February 25 show that year on year, food prices have increased by 35%. And although that figure is half of what it was this time last year, 35% is still a rapid rate of price increases for food. And if we compare that to the rest of the G20, you can see that only Argentina has a higher level of food inflation at the moment. And the current rate of 35% in Turkey ranks it as the 8th most expensive country in the world in terms of food price increases. And this represents a serious problem for a lot of people in Turkey who are living on the breadline. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Turkey over the past 3 years. And what this shows is that over the past 2 years, there's been a significant increase in interest rates. In May 23, rates were sitting at 8.5%. However, by April 24, they'd increased to 50%. And this was actually a major reversal in the policy in Turkey. President Erdogan historically had operated a contrarian policy. So despite the fact that inflation was sitting at very high levels in Turkey, the central bank started reducing interest rates. And unfortunately for Turkey, that actually made the situation worse. So we had falling interest rates and rising inflation for a long period of time. However, following his re-election, the policy was reversed and interest rates were increased rapidly, and that's resulted in inflation going back down. And over the past few months, we've seen the official rate of inflation falling again, and it's currently sitting at 42.5%. However, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, as a result of the political uncertainty which started the stock market crash and the fall in the value of the lira, the central bank in Turkey increased the overnight borrowing rate to 46%. And this indicates that if this instability continues, that the central bank may decide that it needs to start increasing interest rates again. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's going on in Turkey for the past 3 years. And what we've seen over the past 12 months or so is that the indicators were telling us that things are starting to improve. Inflation has started to come back down. Interest rates, whilst they went up significantly during 2023 and the first half of 2024, have actually started to come back down again, and things looked like they were getting back onto an even keel. It's a long road to recovery for Turkey, but they were moving in the right direction. However, what we've seen over the course of the past few days really shows how unstable the economy is, because we've seen a huge amount of volatility as a result of the fact that the main opposition leader was arrested and charged with corruption and various other things. So there is now a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not he will be released, whether or not he'll be allowed to stand against President Erdogan in some future election. That caused a lot of political unrest, and what we've seen is the stock market had its worst single performance since 2008. And just to remind you, the global financial crisis was one of the biggest crises that's affected the global economy. That's why it's called the global financial crisis. So that was an exceptionally bad period. So to be the next worst after that, from Turkey's point of view, tells you that there is a lot of nervousness right now in terms of the financial markets. And also linked to that, we saw the lira performing extremely badly. It fell to its lowest level in its history in one day, and the Turkish central bank had to step in and spend $12 billion supporting the value. So the current value doesn't really reflect where the market would have it if it was just floating without any support from the central bank. So what we're seeing here is that there's a lot of nervousness. Overall, when you look around at what's going on in the global markets, there's a lot of volatility and nervousness, partly caused by what's going on in the USA with Donald Trump and his tariffs. He's tariffing a lot of different countries and economies, and so there's concern that that could potentially throw many of those economies into recession potentially during 2025. So there's a high degree of nervousness all around the globe at the moment. And Turkey, as an emerging economy and one that's historically been very volatile, is susceptible to these huge movements. And it will be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next couple of weeks, whether or not the opposition leader is released and all these charges are dropped, or if he continues to be detained and if he has to go to court. Because if that happens, then it's extremely likely that the volatility will increase and we could see more instability. We could see the markets coming down even more rapidly. So the overall summary of today's video is that over the course of the past few days, we have seen a lot of the good that was done in Turkey in the previous 6 months unwound. We've seen the markets crashing. We've seen the value of the lira crashing. And if the political situation continues as it is, we may well see more economic uncertainty over the course of the next few weeks. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thanks so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much, I really appreciate that. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, your long-term support is really keeping me going, so thank you so much, and here's something to put a smile on your face.